Imagine this: a child, just a few steps away from safety, vanishes without a trace. You know that the clock is ticking, and every second that passes means a life may be slipping through the cracks. This isn't a movie. This isn't fiction. It's a real situation that the FBI faces every day, cases where children's lives hang in the balance. And it's the FBI's job to find them before it's too late. As a former FBI agent, I've lived through some of the most harrowing moments in law enforcement, but none compare to the fear of knowing a child is out there, lost and terrified. In this story, the stakes were higher than ever. A little girl had been abducted, and the clock was ticking down. Before we dive deeper into this emotional and intense journey, hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. Why? Because stories like this are what you need to hear. They're real, raw, and remind us of the incredible work the FBI does to save lives. If you want to know the real-life dangers our agents face, the heart-pounding details, and how they fight for every victim, then this channel is for you. Don't miss out. Now, let's get back to this gripping story. What would you do if a child disappeared in a blink of an eye? How would you react? For the FBI, there's no time for hesitation, only action. In this case, a little girl was taken from her family and the clock was ticking. Every minute that passed brought her closer to being lost forever. The reality of kidnapping. When I first heard about this case, the details were sparse. A 6-year-old girl missing, no leads, no witnesses, just a frantic family and the cold, harsh reality of an abduction. As soon as we received the call, my heart raced. I've worked on many cases, but nothing prepares you for the sinking feeling of knowing an innocent life is in danger. As agents, we're trained to approach every situation methodically, but when you're dealing with a child, someone so vulnerable, the emotions run high. We knew we had to act fast. The first 48 hours are critical in any kidnapping case, and we had no time to waste. Our team mobilized, and every agent was on edge. Our minds raced through every possible scenario: who took her, why, where was she, and, most importantly, could we find her before it was too late? As we gathered information and pieced together the few clues we had, the weight of it all sank in. It wasn't just about finding the child, it was about the fear, the uncertainty that gripped the family. The parents' hope was fading, and the urgency was becoming palpable. My own team was feeling it too. You can train your whole career to stay focused, to keep emotions in check, but there's something about a child in peril that shakes you to your core. But we couldn't afford to let that emotion take over. We had to be calm. We had to think. We had to act. And we did. Through surveillance, witness reports, and countless hours of tireless work, we began to close in on the kidnapper. But there were still more questions than answers. Was she still alive? Where was she being held? Time was running out, and every decision had the potential to change everything. Stay with me. This is just the beginning. The stakes were higher than ever, and we were in a race against time. This story is going to hit you hard, and it's only going to get more intense from here. You'll see firsthand what the FBI faces, the risks we take, and the cost of saving an innocent life. So keep watching. This is real life. This is the fight for survival. When the call came in, it was a typical day at the office. But soon, everything changed. I could feel the weight in the air, the same way I always did when something major was about to happen. A child had been taken. No ransom, no demands, just a little girl vanished. The first step was clear. We had to act fast. There's no time to waste in an abduction case. The first 48 hours are the most crucial in determining whether a child will be found alive. As FBI agents, we're trained to stay focused, to think rationally under pressure. But when you're dealing with the kidnapping of a child, the pressure is unbearable. I remember the sense of urgency that gripped our entire team. We were all professionals, seasoned agents. But this case, it felt different. The stakes were higher. A life, an innocent life, was in the balance. Every move we made, every lead we followed, carried immense weight. There was no room for error. We couldn't afford to hesitate. As we sifted through the evidence, The magnitude of the situation became clear. This wasn't just another case. This wasn't a routine investigation. It wasn't like catching a fugitive or solving a white-collar crime. This was a race against time, a mission to save a child who had been ripped from her family's arms. And that responsibility, saving her, was on our shoulders. I recall the faces of my fellow agents, each one of us trying to remain calm, keeping our emotions in check. But you could see it in their eyes, the fear, the anxiety, the determination to bring that little girl home. We all knew how personal this was. In a job where we're used to handling high-pressure situations, this one hit hard. We weren't just agents following a trail. We were human beings who understood that a family's world had just been shattered. There were moments of silence between us, not because we were afraid, but because we knew the weight of the task ahead. No matter how many times we trained for these situations, there was something about a child being taken that hit differently. It was the innocent lives at stake that made us fight harder, push further, and go beyond what we thought was possible. We divided our tasks: surveillance, interviews, and tracking down every lead, no matter how small. Each time we spoke with witnesses, each new piece of information we gathered, we were closer to finding her. But there was no guarantee. Nothing was certain. The kidnapper could have moved her to a new location by now. The trail could have gone cold. As we pursued every avenue, the hours stretched into long, sleepless nights. There was no time for rest. The pressure, the urgency, it was suffocating. The weight of the case was heavy on all of us. In those quiet moments, when we were alone with our thoughts, we wondered, would we find her? Could we save her in time? But there was no room for doubt. There was only action. We had a job to do, and no matter how difficult it seemed, no matter how much it weighed on us, we couldn't stop until that little girl was safe. The only thing that kept us moving forward was the knowledge that we couldn't give up. Not now, not ever. At that moment, I realized that being part of the FBI isn't just about solving crimes. It's about saving lives. It's about fighting against the clock, fighting against fear, and fighting for those who can't fight for themselves. And sometimes, the most important fight is the one you can't see. It's the emotional toll it takes on you, the mental strength required to keep going, even when the world feels like it's closing in. The clock was ticking, and we were running out of time. It wasn't long before we hit our first break in the case. As the hours passed and the pressure mounted, every agent in the room focused on the smallest details. But finding the right lead in a case like this is like trying to find a needle in a haystack. The kidnapper had covered his tracks well. We had no eyewitnesses, no demands, just a frightened family and a small child who had been taken without a trace. Our team had split into smaller groups, and my unit was tasked with combing through surveillance footage from nearby shops, gas stations, and street cameras. The idea was simple. Someone had to have seen something, even if it was the smallest detail, something out of place. It was late into the night, and we were all exhausted, but this was the critical moment. The longer we went without a clue, the more we feared for the child's safety. Then we found it, a blurry figure caught on a security camera near a convenience store, walking quickly down a side street. The footage was grainy, but it was enough to give us a place to start. The person in the video didn't appear to be in a rush, but the way they moved, their posture, everything about that moment seemed off. It was a man, about average height, wearing a jacket, his face partially obscured by a hood. There were no other pedestrians around, and that isolation was a red flag. We zoomed in, examined every detail, and started comparing the footage to other nearby cameras. There was a clear pattern. The man had passed through certain areas that were now, in retrospect, important. He was heading in the direction of a warehouse district on the outskirts of town, a place I knew well from my years in the field. It was a desolate area, away from prying eyes, perfect for someone who wanted to avoid being seen. This was the first solid lead we had, but even as we honed in on this man's movements, something in the back of my mind kept nagging at me. I had seen this type of evasive behavior before. He wasn't just a random criminal. This felt calculated. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing, someone who was familiar with evading law enforcement. But that wasn't enough to deter us. Our next step was to identify this man. We knew we had to track his movements, catch him before he realized we were onto him. With the warehouse district now firmly in our sights, we started gathering more information, combing through records, and checking local businesses for any signs of activity in the area. I'll never forget the silence that fell over the team as we sat around the table. We were all waiting for the breakthrough, for confirmation that we were on the right track. The case had reached a critical point, and even though the first clue had given us a glimpse of hope, there was still the haunting uncertainty. What if this was another dead end? But we couldn't afford to think that way, not when a child's life was at stake. As we dug deeper, I saw the exhaustion in the faces of my fellow agents. Hours without rest were starting to take their toll, but this was it. This was the turning point. We had a suspect, and we were closing in, but we knew we couldn't make any rash moves. We had to be sure, we had to be strategic. As the investigation continued, I was constantly reminded of the weight of the mission. This wasn't just about catching a criminal, it was about saving a child, bringing a family's daughter home. This case was personal to every one of us. The first clue was small, but it was enough to ignite the fire within the team. We weren't just chasing shadows anymore, we had a real lead. Now it was time to go after the kidnapper with everything we had. The moment we identified the warehouse district as the potential location, everything intensified. The first lead we had was pointing us in the right direction, but we knew that the kidnapper would be ready for anything. It was a cold, windy night when we gathered outside the district, the entire team silently preparing for what could be the most dangerous moment of our careers. We didn't know what awaited us in that rundown building, but we knew one thing for sure. This was no longer just an investigation. It was a life-or-death operation. As we moved into position, the tension was palpable. We had to stay silent and move with precision. No room for mistakes. The area was desolate, lit only by the faint glow of streetlights flickering through the mist. We communicated through hand signals, keeping the noise to an absolute minimum. We couldn't afford to alert the kidnappers. They had a child in their grasp, and we had to assume they would do anything to protect their prize. I remember the feeling in my chest, the kind of anxiety that comes with knowing a confrontation was inevitable. In our line of work, you get used to fear, you learn to push it aside, to stay focused. But when you know that the enemy is cornered and desperate, the stakes become even higher. This wasn't about making an arrest, it was about saving a life. And that's the hardest part. You have to be prepared for anything. We had gathered enough intel to know where the kidnappers were hiding. The warehouse was the perfect place, isolated, abandoned, and full of hiding spots. There were no guarantees, but we had no choice but to move in. I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins as we approached the front of the building. My mind raced through the countless scenarios that could unfold. What if they resisted? What if they had weapons? What if they tried to hurt the child in a desperate attempt to escape? I had seen criminals do terrible things in my years with the FBI, but this was different. We couldn't let them harm her. As we neared the entrance, I could hear muffled voices coming from within. Our instincts were sharp, but even then, the fear of what we might find lingered. We had to move in fast. My heart pounded in my chest as we breached the door, guns drawn, ready for anything. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The kidnappers had clearly heard us coming. We had interrupted their plans, and now they were ready to fight. The confrontation that followed was chaotic. The kidnappers, a small group of individuals with nothing to lose, didn't hesitate to engage. They had the child in their possession, and they were not about to give her up without a fight. I remember the sound of gunshots ringing through the cold air. It was chaos. In the blink of an eye, the situation escalated from a tense standoff to a violent struggle for survival. We moved swiftly, covering each other's backs, but the danger was clear. These were criminals willing to do anything to protect their spoils. I won't lie. There were moments of doubt, you could see the fear in my teammates' eyes, but there was no time for hesitation. If we faltered for even a second, the kidnappers could escape with the child, or worse, harm her. Every move had to be calculated. Every decision carried the weight of a life. The gunfire continued, but we didn't retreat. We pressed forward, determined to get to her before it was too late. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we cornered the kidnappers. They were trapped, but the danger wasn't over yet. They still had the child, and now they were panicking. It's in moments like these, when criminals are cornered and desperate, that you truly see the dark side of humanity, but we couldn't let fear control us. We had one mission: save the child. With tactical precision, we managed to disarm the kidnappers and secure the child. The relief that swept over me in that moment was indescribable. The operation was a success, but it came at a cost. We had faced down violent criminals in a high-stakes confrontation, and not everyone walked away unscathed. But the most important thing was that we had done our job. We had saved a life. In the aftermath, when the adrenaline faded and the dust settled, I couldn't help but reflect on the toll this job takes on you. There are moments of intense danger, moments that can change your life forever, but in the end, you remember why you do it. To save lives, to protect the innocent, and to ensure that justice is served. That night, we didn't just stop a crime, we saved a little girl's future. When we finally rescued the child from the kidnappers, the immediate relief was overwhelming, but it was only a fleeting moment. What came next was the hardest part of the entire mission, witnessing the toll that this ordeal had taken on a little girl who was now in our care. For the first time, we saw the face of a victim, the face of innocence that had been violated, a child who had experienced unspeakable fear. As the team rushed her out of the warehouse, I saw her shivering, wide-eyed, with dirt and tears staining her small face. She had been through so much, and yet all she did was cling to the closest agent she could find. The weight of it hit me harder than I had anticipated. We were trained to stay strong, to be professional, but in that moment I felt a pain in my chest that I had never experienced before. This wasn't just another criminal case. This wasn't a statistic or a file number. This was a little girl, a child who had been snatched from the world she knew, thrust into a nightmare she shouldn't have had to endure. I tried to comfort her, telling her everything would be okay, but the look in her eyes said everything. She didn't trust anyone. Her world had been shattered. I could see the trauma in her expression. This was a life forever altered by people who showed no care for the innocents they were destroying. It wasn't the kind of case that could be closed with an arrest. The damage had already been done. In that moment, I realized that this wasn't just about catching criminals. It was about helping heal the broken lives left in their wake. I'll never forget the sound of her voice when she finally spoke. Her words were soft, hesitant, as if speaking to us meant breaking some sort of fragile barrier. She asked, "Where's my mummy?" Her question was simple, yet it carried an immense weight. She wasn't just asking for her mother, she was asking for safety, for comfort, for reassurance that she was going to be okay. It took everything in me not to let my emotions spill out. I had seen a lot in my years as an FBI agent, but there was something about a child's vulnerability that always struck the hardest. Our job didn't end with rescuing her. As much as we wanted to believe that we had done our duty, the truth was far more complex. The physical safety of the child was just the beginning. The emotional and psychological scars would follow her for the rest of her life. That's something no one tells you when you join the FBI. You're prepared for the adrenaline-filled pursuits, the rush of the chase, the satisfaction of arresting dangerous criminals. But you're never quite ready for the emotional toll it takes to witness the aftermath of the trauma. We worked with trauma specialists, counselors, and her family, but nothing could erase what she had been through. It wasn't just about making sure she was fed and safe, it was about restoring her sense of trust in the world. The emotional recovery from a traumatic experience like this would take years, and even then, there was no certainty that she would ever feel truly safe again. That's the hardest part of being an FBI agent. You can arrest the bad guys, close the case files and get back to business, but there are always lingering consequences. The criminals we apprehended, the ones who committed these heinous acts, would eventually face justice, but the real toll was on the victims. The child who had been kidnapped would carry that trauma with her forever. Even years after the case was closed, I found myself thinking about her, wondering how she was doing, if she ever found peace. It's something that sticks with you. We don't always get closure. We don't always get to see the aftermath of our work, but in some cases, especially when children are involved, it's impossible to forget. The faces of the victims stay with you, long after the criminal has been arrested, long after the case is closed. In the end, I was proud of what we did. We saved her life, but that image of her fragile face staring back at me with confusion and fear will never leave my mind. No matter how many cases I worked on, no matter how many dangerous criminals I apprehended, the emotional toll of this case reminded me of the true cost of doing what we do. We fight for justice, but sometimes justice isn't enough to erase the damage already done. Sometimes all we can do is be there for the victims, for the people whose lives will never be the same again. The aftermath of the rescue was only the beginning. We had the child, yes, but the mission was far from over. Now came the difficult part, bringing those responsible for the abduction to justice. As relieved as we all were that the child was safe, the reality set in that the kidnappers were still out there, somewhere, and they would stop at nothing to avoid being caught. I remember the first meeting we had after the child was taken to safety. The team was exhausted, but we couldn't afford to lose focus. We were only at the start of the journey. These criminals hadn't just taken an innocent life, they had committed an act of horror, one that needed to be answered for. The child was safe now, but there were still unanswered questions. Who were they? Why had they done it? And, most importantly, where were they hiding? We knew the kidnappers wouldn't simply vanish. They'd made mistakes. It's always the case with criminals. They leave behind a trail, but finding that trail, tracking their every move, was no small task. The warehouse district had been a good starting point, but now we needed to dive deeper. We had to piece together their identities, their connections, and their network. The investigation became a relentless grind of sifting through information. We reviewed hours of security footage, spoke to witnesses, and went over the child's statements repeatedly. There were still so many unknowns. It wasn't enough to just know where they had been. We had to know who they were. The emotional toll of the case, the fear I had felt when we first confronted the kidnappers, was now replaced by a singular driving need for justice. They couldn't get away with this. The deeper we dug, the more we uncovered. The kidnappers weren't just random criminals, they were organized, there was a network, and we were beginning to connect the dots. The more I learned, the more disgusted I became. These weren't just people who wanted money, they were predators, and they'd been operating for far longer than we initially suspected. I recall one particularly grueling night, hunched over a desk, combing through criminal records, and looking for anything that could link the kidnappers to past crimes. Every file seemed like a potential piece of the puzzle, and yet it all felt like we were just one step away from the breakthrough we desperately needed. I could feel the frustration growing. We had already risked so much, and the pressure to bring these criminals to justice was starting to wear on the team. But giving up was never an option. We finally got our break when we tracked down a piece of vital information, a lead that connected the kidnappers to a known criminal organization. It wasn't much at first, just a small detail buried deep within the police files, but it was enough to fuel our next move. The organization had a history of abductions, and their tactics were eerily similar to what we had just experienced. This was our moment. We had to follow this lead to its end, and we had to do it quickly. At that point, everything moved fast. The investigation escalated as we prepared to make arrests. We coordinated with local law enforcement, gathered all the intel we had on these individuals, and made our move. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still in the dark. It was one thing to know where they were hiding, it was another to catch them. We were about to embark on a dangerous operation, one that would bring us face to face with these criminals. The tension in the air was thick. My team was prepared, but the fear of what could happen still lingered. We had to move quickly and carefully. there was no room for error. These criminals were capable of anything. The next hours were a blur of adrenaline and action. We stormed the hideout, and as we rushed in, I found myself once again staring down the barrel of a gun. This time, though, there was no hesitation. We had the element of surprise, and within moments, we had the kidnappers in custody. The terror in their eyes when they realized they had been caught was unmistakable. For us, it was a sense of justice finally being served. But even in that moment of triumph, I couldn't help but feel conflicted. The child was safe, yes, but the emotional scars would remain. As I looked at the faces of the criminals who had done this, I thought of everything they had put that little girl through. I thought about the family, the sleepless nights, and the relentless pursuit of justice. It was over, but in some ways it had only just begun. The journey wasn't just about catching the kidnappers, it was about showing that the FBI would always fight for those who couldn't protect themselves, no matter how long it took. And this case, this moment, would stay with me forever. It reminded me of why we do what we do and the sacrifices we make along the way. When the operation was over and the kidnappers were behind bars, we finally had time to breathe. But as the dust settled, something became painfully clear to me. We had saved the child, yes, but the journey didn't end there. The emotional toll of what we had just been through, the fear, the uncertainty, the high-stakes confrontations had left an indelible mark on all of us. For me, that was the hardest part of this entire operation, the psychological weight that lingers long after the physical danger has passed. The kidnapper's arrest was a victory for justice, but it was bittersweet. As much as we wanted to believe that the case was closed, we knew that the child's life would never be the same again. For her, the nightmare wasn't just over with the sound of handcuffs snapping shut, it was just beginning. There would be a long road ahead for her. The trauma she had experienced couldn't be erased. No matter how many counseling sessions or supportive measures we offered, the scars would remain. I remember sitting in the quiet of my office, staring out the window. The phone calls were all wrapped up, the reports filed away, but the faces of the victims, the child, her parents, were still with me. And in some ways, they always would be. It was hard not to think about the things we could have done differently, or wonder if we had missed any signs earlier. As an FBI agent, you're trained to compartmentalize your emotions, to stay detached from the pain that you witness. But when it comes to a child, it's different. You can't simply shut off that side of you. The team and I had been through a lot together. Each one of us felt the impact of what had happened. We had saved a life, but the cost was real. The nightmares, the deep-rooted fear we saw in the child's eyes, the pain in her family's faces, it all haunted us. Some nights after long shifts, I'd lie awake, replaying the entire sequence of events in my head, wondering if there was more we could have done. What really hit me was how quickly the focus shifted from the criminals to the recovery process. Saving the child was just the start, and it was the smallest part of the larger journey. The real work now was in helping her rebuild her life, making sure she was given every chance to overcome the horrors she had experienced. But we as agents also had to face the reality of what we had witnessed. The job had changed us all in ways we hadn't anticipated. I could see the toll it took on my colleagues. Each one of us carried a different burden, but we all carried the same sense of duty. In the moments when we sat together in silence, there was an unspoken understanding between us. We had done our job, but the emotional weight of the case would stay with us forever. The guilt, the frustration of knowing the child would never fully recover, lingered like a shadow over us. But even as the emotional toll continued to affect us, I couldn't shake the feeling that despite everything, we had done the right thing. We had fought for that child's life, and we had brought the kidnappers to justice. For all the pain, all the lingering sadness, that was something to be proud of. It was easy to get lost in the difficulty of the situation, but the reality was that in the end, the child was safe, the kidnappers were in custody, and justice had been served. In this job, we often focus so much on the mission that we forget the human aspect, the toll it takes on both the victims and ourselves. But that's what makes the work we do meaningful. We're not just solving cases, we're changing lives. We're saving futures, even if the scars remain. And in the darkest moments, when it feels like everything is too much to bear, it's the knowledge that we've made a difference that keeps us going. After the kidnappers were arrested, the immediate relief we felt was tempered by the reality of what was to come next. the long, drawn-out legal process. As agents, our job didn't stop once we had the criminals in custody. Now, we had to prepare for a trial. And while bringing someone to justice is often seen as the conclusion of a case, in reality, it's just the beginning of another grueling chapter. For the victims and their families, it can feel like the nightmare isn't over, even after the criminals are locked away. The first step in the legal process was to build a solid case. We had the kidnappers, but now we needed to ensure that the evidence we had gathered was strong enough to hold up in court. Every detail mattered. Every piece of evidence had to be meticulously examined, documented, and presented. This was no longer about just catching the criminals. It was about ensuring they paid for their actions in a court of law. I vividly remember preparing for the trial. The hours we spent in the office reviewing every statement, every piece of footage, every scrap of evidence. We weren't just looking for guilt. We were building a narrative, one that would convince a jury that these kidnappers were not just criminals but monsters who had caused untold harm to a vulnerable child. It was a delicate balance, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. Every misstep could mean the kidnappers walking free, and I knew we couldn't let that happen. What hit me the hardest during this part of the process was the weight of what the child had gone through. As we prepared to present the case, we had to be mindful of her. The last thing we wanted was to subject her to even more trauma by making her relive the horrors of her abduction. It was a fine line to walk. We needed her testimony to convict these criminals, but at what cost? I remember speaking to her counselor, asking for advice on how to handle her involvement in the case. It was heartbreaking. There was no easy way to do this. She had already suffered so much. The court process wasn't just about proving guilt, it was about ensuring the criminals were held accountable for their actions. But as much as we were focused on the trial, I couldn't help but think about the long-term consequences for the child. No matter how the case went, she would never be the same again. This was a child who had been robbed of her innocence, and the courtroom was just one part of the larger healing process. When the trial finally began, the tension in the room was palpable. I sat in the back, watching as the prosecution laid out the case against the kidnappers. The defense tried to argue that the defendants were coerced, that they hadn't acted with full intent, but it was clear to everyone in the room that this wasn't a case of mistaken identity or a random act. These were calculated, malicious criminals who had planned every step of the abduction with precision. The testimonies were gut-wrenching, especially as the child's voice cracked when recounting what had happened. It was impossible not to feel the weight of her words. Every person in the courtroom felt the same thing. Even the defense attorneys, though they were doing their job, couldn't mask their discomfort. I could see the jury's reactions. They were visibly moved by the child's bravery, and I knew, in that moment, the case was turning in our favor. But despite the emotional impact of the trial, there was still the legal battle to fight. We had to ensure that the criminals were convicted, that they wouldn't be allowed to harm anyone again. The final stages of the trial were intense, as the defense threw every possible argument at us, trying to find any loophole, any technicality that could secure the kidnappers' release. It was exhausting, mentally and emotionally draining. But we couldn't give up. We had to see it through. In the end, justice prevailed. The kidnappers were convicted and the child's safety was secured. But I'll never forget the toll the trial took on everyone involved. As much as we celebrated the victory, I knew that the journey for the child was far from over. She had been through so much already, and now the healing process would truly begin. The legal battle was won, but the emotional battle was something that would stay with all of us forever. The victory in the courtroom was important, but the real success was knowing that we had done everything we could to protect that child, to give her the chance to live a life free from fear. The cost of justice was high, but in the end, it was worth it. In the aftermath of the trial, as the kidnappers were convicted and sent to prison, there was a sense of accomplishment in the air, but not the kind of triumph that makes you feel like you've just won a battle. No, this was different. It was the kind of success that leaves you questioning the true cost of the work we do as FBI agents. You see, saving a life, stopping a crime, it doesn't always come with a clear-cut, celebratory ending. Sometimes it comes with something much harder to deal with, the knowledge that while we did our job, the world has changed for the victims and it can never go back to what it was. When we secured the conviction of the kidnappers, there was a feeling of justice served, no doubt. But it was hard to ignore the weight that lingered. For the child, life would never be the same. For the family, they had been through an unimaginable ordeal. And for me and my team, the emotional toll of what we had witnessed, the fear in that little girl's eyes, the feeling of helplessness that we could never fully erase, was something we'd carry with us forever. People often ask me if I feel proud of the work we did, of the arrests we made, of the justice we brought. And I'm not going to lie, there's a part of me that feels good about what we accomplished. But there's also a part of me that feels something much more complicated, a sense of loss, a sense of responsibility for the lasting effects this case had on everyone involved. The child we saved would grow up, but she would never be the same. The road to recovery for her would be long and filled with challenges, and no matter how many times we told ourselves we had done enough, we knew we couldn't take away the trauma she had faced. It's hard to explain, but when you spend years working cases like this, you start to understand that the victories aren't always as simple as closing a file. There's always more to it. Saving someone's life, stopping a criminal, it's a moment of relief, but there's a sense of weight that comes with it. The memories, the emotions, the pain you witness, it sticks with you, and as much as we try to compartmentalize, there's no escaping the fact that we're human too. For the team, this case left a lasting impact. We'd all seen terrible things over the years, but this one hit closer to home than most. We were all affected in different ways, and it wasn't just about the long hours, the adrenaline of the chase, or even the joy of making an arrest. It was about the child's face, the way she clung to us after her rescue, the way her innocent world had been torn apart. It was about knowing that our work was far from over. We might have saved her life, but there was still so much more she had to endure. I remember one evening, after the trial had ended, sitting with one of my colleagues in the break room, the weight of the case still hanging over us. We talked about the child, about what she'd gone through, and about the long recovery process that was still ahead. We talked about the case, but there was one thing we didn't talk about: how we were really feeling. We didn't have the words for it. How do you explain the quiet sadness that lingers after a victory? How do you reconcile saving someone's life with the realization that they'll never fully recover? In the end, I think the hardest part of the job is not the arrests or the danger or the rush of the chase. The hardest part is the emotional impact. The hardest part is knowing that the work we do, no matter how important it is, can never undo the trauma that victims endure. The child we saved would always carry the weight of what had happened to her, but she wasn't alone anymore, and as agents, neither were we. So yes, we got our justice. We brought the kidnappers to trial, and we secured a conviction, but the real reward, the one that no amount of success can replace, was seeing the child safe, seeing her finally surrounded by people who loved and cared for her. It wasn't the victory we thought it would be, but it was a victory nonetheless. The kind of victory that's about more than just the case. It's about the lives we touch and the humanity we fight for. That's the real price of justice. And while I'll never forget the faces of the victims, while I'll always remember the difficult moments of that case, I also know this: we did what we could. And in this job, that's sometimes the best we can hope for.